All right. So just a quick introduction. So I work in the networks team at Imperial College, London, which is a London-based university with 23,000 students and 8,000 staff. We've got around 50,000 unique wired hosts on the network, and our wireless these days sees about 35,000 plus clients at peak during the day. A couple of 100 gig connections to Janet, and we operate a network that's made up of many VRFs over MPLS layer 3 VPNs, and we use firewalls to sit between those VRFs and to the internet. We've been IPv6 enabled on much of the network from about 2010. That is dual stack on most client networks. And these days, around half of our internet traffic is v6. And for our high energy physics, with their private VRF to the LHC, about 97% of that traffic is v6. We've got the usual suspects enabled for v6, web, DNS, SM, mail, and such like. And we, some years ago, when we changed out our load balancers, took the opportunity to put quad A's on most things that were load balanced, because that was quite easy to do and we didn't have to speak to the applications in order to do that. We could just do that in the midpoint. And for some years we've mandated v6 on tenders. And I spoke 18 months ago or so on us having brought up a new HPC cluster that has continued to be v6 only, using DNS64 and NAT64, with CLAT-D running on all of the nodes in that HPC, which is quite easy to do when they're all booting a standard image that we control and can roll CLAT-D into. But in that respect, we've already got experience with DNS64, NAT64, and 464XLAT. Which then brings me on to the purpose of this talk, which is the wireless. About a year ago, we secured the agreement for funding to replace our wireless estate, and began running a tender to do so. Oh, I've missed a cut. Oh, I'm the wrong button. I skipped these two slides here, which was just to add some context to our traffic. So that's our standard internet connection that the LHC traffic doesn't go over. Peaks at about 20 gig, and half of it is v6. And that demonstrates our high energy physics managing to flatline our other Janet link with v6 traffic. That is a couple of years old, and they don't do that every day. So I have to go into the archives to pull that one out because it's interesting. Skipping back to the wireless anyway, sorry. We had about 5,000 APs on what we're now calling the legacy wireless platform, based around, it was a Cisco-based platform with on-prem controllers. It was years end of life by the time we secured the funding to replace it. And we got that funding on the basis of replacing it over a 1 to 2 year window. The platform that the way we were running it, we were using public IPv4 space for all the client networks on it. So we were burning a /17 of address space, and then some in smaller blocks for other things. As a consequence of that, we were running extremely short DHCPv4 leases because we were trying to squeeze about as many clients into the amount of IP addresses that we actually had. We had to turn those addresses over as soon as the clients disconnected. And we dual stacked v6 onto that, and using Slack to assign addresses. And as a consequence of being public addresses, there was no NAT on that wireless. So about a year ago, we put the tender out. We awarded that tender in due course to Juniper Mist, and we then started. This was around the time of this event last year, when Jen gave a very good talk on IPv6-Mostly, and it seeded the idea that this could be an opportunity to actually give it a go. The benefit being that this was always going to be a gradual rollout. So we weren't just going to turn it on overnight for 35,000 users. We could turn it on a building at a time as we rolled out the new wireless and when people were accepting of some change in other respects. So the wireless the plan that we came up with, around 6,500 APs. The growth there, in part, was due to filling in some coverage gaps, but mostly that extra number of APs came from putting in-room APs into the remaining halls of residences. We'd already gone down that route for some of them, and we are bringing parity to the remaining halls. So kind of hotel style, an AP that takes the place of the faceplate. The new system is cloud-based control. Juniper would say it's controllerless, but it does and we're making use of the tunneling boxes so that we can tunnel the client traffic back to a central location, because that really fits with the kind of network that we need to deliver, and not least things like our guest network, where we're handed some client networks that we need to distribute across the site, and it's not easy to just get them everywhere without centrally tunneling it. The new network, we're using RFC 1918 v4. We're not burning public address space on this anymore, and as a consequence, we've introduced NAT4.4. And then we set out to go IPv6-Mostly on this. So Slack again, as we had, but also now introducing our DNSS to hand out v6 DNS servers, NAT6.4 and DNS6.4, DHCP-v4 option 108 in order to allow clients to opt out of v4, Pref6.4 in order to advertise the prefix via an alternative route to DNS. And our aim was to run v6 only for the management and control of these APs. I don't want to go into great detail of how v6-Mostly works, because actually you'd be better off watching Jen's video from a year ago. But just as a kind of, in a nutshell, in case anyone in the room isn't fully up to speed, the building blocks of it essentially rely on having a dual stack network, v4, v6, having NAT6.4 and DNS6.4 in play, getting some v6 DNS servers to your clients, whether that's over DHCP-v6 or via our DNSS, and configuring your DHCP-v4 server to be able to respond to option 108 requests. The client can then discover which NAT prefix to use by either doing a DNS lookup to a well-known address that should never return a v6 address unless DNS6.4 is doing so, from which it can gather the NAT prefix, or by Pref6.4 putting it directly into the RAs that the client receives. And in response to having been able to get an option 108 response back from the DHCP v6 v4 server, a client will then fire up its CLAT client and handle the 4 side of 464 XLAT. And this is built into Android, iOS, and macOS. So in respect to the management of this platform, there were various bits that needed to work over v6. The APs did Slack correctly. They were able to get their DNS servers over our DNSS and use them. NTP worked over v6. We got Radius working over v6 without too much difficulty. Cloud communications, this wasn't their day one, but Juniper delivered this within a month or two. That's the APs being able to talk to the cloud. The sticking point up until a couple of months ago, however, was that the tunneling of the client traffic back to the on-prem tunneling boxes did not support v6. That has now come, it's tested, and it works. And so whilst we deployed with dual stack 6 months ago, we ought to be able to go back and pull that v4 back out now. Subject to some more testing, it should be capable of running v6 only now. To the deployment, we started deploying in June. Come July, we ramped this deployment up, and between July and September, we had multiple contractors. That's three different contractor companies working every weekend for 3 months deploying these things. And to that end, we managed to get 3,000 of these APs out over those 3 months, leaving us with about 2,400 left to date, which we've taken a pause for the start of term, but we've now started deploying these again. And the vast majority of those are in halls of residences. We've upgraded most of the academic spaces. And if anyone has read ahead on this side, you'll see that the number everyone has been waiting for there of what is the result of v6-Mostly. Well, over the last week, that was 2 evenings ago when I pulled these statistics, we've seen 71,000 unique MAC addresses across our main SSID. That's not EduRoam or Guest, but what our users are on internally. 71,000 unique MAC addresses, of which 16,000 had v4. So we are seeing a rate of 77% of devices on the network no longer using v4. And this graph here is from the perspective of our firewall receiving traffic from clients on the wireless network. And this is the same firewall, a pair of Juniper SRXs that are handling the NAT64. And you can see at around July, which is when we started this rollout, we went from around a level of about 60% of traffic between client and firewall being v6 to now about 80. And we're not done deploying yet. So time will tell over the next few months how high that goes. But it's very clear on the graph when we actually started deploying this. And this is the last slide, but covers quite a lot in terms of the experiences we've had along the way. Most of these all bitters at the start of term. I mean, we were ramping this deployment up over the summer when it was a quiet time, and there weren't many students around. There were quite a lot of staff, but it allowed us to gain the confidence that we had no big showstopper problems when the students arrived. We were pretty confident that we weren't going to be inundated with problems. However, we did shake things out. And the first one isn't actually v6 related at all. It is, however, specific to the new the architecture of the new platform. And that is, we've gone from a controller-based platform where all the radius requests come from a few central controllers acting as the NASs, to going to APs talking directly to the radius servers. And a consequence of this that we hadn't quite appreciated until we actually started seeing some large numbers of clients is that when a client roams between APs now, we're seeing accounting from every AP as they go along, whereas previously they were largely staying on the same controller, and so there's a lot more accounting traffic now than there was. And we had to do something with that, but we beefed up the radius infrastructure, grew the databases, and we're handling it. The second problem that we encountered, another load issue, partly down to the time of year. I mean, we had an influx of students, and we're now a lot busier, and the DHCP load went up as a result of that. But this was compounded by option 108. Specifically, the nature by which option 108 increases the amount of DHCP discovers, because after the back-off time, which we initially set low to 5 minutes, and this was because we still had, I mean, aside from the fact that it gave us a safety net if we needed to pull this quickly, we also had two wireless networks sat within sight of each other, i.e. we may have upgraded one building but not another. And if we had a client roam onto one network, we didn't want to have seeded them with the idea that they can give up on v4 for the next half an hour if they flip-flop back onto the old wireless and didn't actually disconnect and reconnect in order to clear that timer. But as a consequence, every time that 5 minutes was up, the client issued a new DHCP discover. It wasn't renewing a lease, but it was going through the discover process again. And this actually hit the DDoS limit on our Juniper MXs, and they started dropping all DHCP traffic. We increased those, and our DHCP servers seem to be keeping up with the load. And we have subsequently increased that timer to the RSC default of 30 minutes. Although, curiously, it hasn't actually caused quite the dramatic drop in requests as we had expected, which I think speaks to we get a lot of short-lived connections on the network. And now we're largely on, neither of those was actually reported by users. Our monitoring picked those problems up and we dealt with them. We had a problem with macOS 12, which was the first version of macOS, I believe, that introduced option 108 support. And it did not have support for DNS-based discovery of the NAT prefix. It instead relied on Pref64. And we didn't initially deploy Pref64 here because the software we were running on our Juniper routers didn't support it. So as a consequence of that, we found that Monterey busily enabled its CLAC exercised DHP option 108 and didn't take up its v4 lease, but it didn't engage its CLAC client. And so we had broken v4 on some Macs, which manifested as people complaining that they couldn't connect to v4 literals and this kind of thing. And half the time we were able to advise users that you use an FQDN instead. But in some cases that wasn't, that there were applications that really needed it. But deploying Pref64 fixed that. We use in-room APs, as I said, in our Hall of Residences. And one of our initial deployment of these APs was to leverage the MAC authentication on the upstream switches. So the AP would come up on the upstream switch and MAC auth into our management network. And this was fine right up until someone plugged a phone or a games console or something into the wired ports, which would then be passed through to the upstream switch port, would then MAC auth that device into a different one, meaning that the AP was now seeing RAs for both those VLANs, given that the APs are using v6-based radius with no v4 fallback, the minute someone plugged a phone into these things, it broke the v6 on the APs and it broke the radius, and thus it broke the wireless on the APs as well. The fix to this was to use the not documented but available functionality on these APs to actually tunnel the wired port, MAC auth the wired ports separately to the radius server and tunnel the traffic back to back to the edge appliances, the same as wireless clients. And now those upstream switch ports are seeing nothing more than the AP itself, and there are no rogue RAs, and the v6 isn't broken. So again, something that we've fixed. The next two issues that we have encountered are not things that we've really that are within our power to fix. We're still troubleshooting these to some extent. It's difficult because the devices in question these aren't corporate devices. These are devices that users have, often only prevalent on specific vendors with specific versions of software, and we can't readily get our hands on all these things. However, we have managed to reproduce this Samsung issue on the bench. Some Samsung phones on at least some versions of software, and at least on O2 as a carrier, Wi-Fi calling does not work. It works initially and then it stops working. And packet captures show that what seems to happen is that when CLAT is running on those Android phones, those phones don't cease sending keep alives on the backhauled on the IPsec tunnels that the Wi-Fi calling relies on. As soon as you stop responding to option 108 and the CLAT clients disable them, they send keep alives. And so the problem is that those Wi-Fi calling tunnels drop, and therefore the phone, and if you try and make an outbound call, it fails a couple of times until it reestablishes a tunnel, and then it works, and inbound calls just don't work because the network can't signal to the phone that its tunnel has gone down. Our fix for that has been, for the time being, to authenticate such devices that users are reporting problems with into a different subnet that doesn't have option 108. The next one, with Honor devices, again, they're Android-based handsets made by the Chinese manufacturer Honor. I think it was spun off from Huawei a few years ago and is now a separate company. Again, and this one we haven't managed to get our hands on one of these devices to actually see firsthand. But what seems to be happening with these devices from the reports that we've got is that the underlying phone running Android is exercising option 108 as it should, but that the GUI or the bit of the phone that actually handles the connecting to the wireless network itself, it decides that because it's not got a v4 address, which the Android OS deliberately didn't take up, that Wi-Fi network is not operable and it disconnects. It says IPv4 address timeout and then disconnects. And so you can't actually maintain a connection to the SSID. Again, we've put those clients as users report them onto a different network now without option 108. And then we're into the weeds. We have not managed to troubleshoot all of these things yet, but we have had reports of at least 4 different VPN vendors not working. Cisco AnyConnect, of which we have found some release notes from Cisco that suggest that it's a known issue on at least mobile devices. However, this is Macs we're talking about. Global Protect, Avanti, Connect Secure, previously called Pulse, used to be owned by Juniper, isn't anymore, and PryTunnel, which I gather is an umbrella for OpenVPN and WireGuard, I think. I caveat this a bit because these aren't necessarily option 108 problems. Some of them probably are, but this could be the fact that we've gone onto RFC 1918 space. Maybe some of these, some of the organizations that are using these products are just using the same RFC 1918 space as us on our wireless. Or it may be an MTU related problem. We really need to drill down into these, but we've got a handful of these jobs that we do need to spend some time on now to understand. And the other one, which I've put up here rather vaguely as wireless screen sharing, by this is a specific AV product that we have used at some places in the university. And the way it works is it uses Bluetooth to discover a device within its proximity in order for that device to know which IP address to connect to in order to cast a screen to it. And what it does is over Bluetooth, it advertises its IP address, and it advertises its v4 IP address, and the Mac that is running that's trying to share its screen to it. Well, when it gets a v4 address, it doesn't know. It seemingly the discovery goes wrong, and unless it can broadcast a v6 address, which it doesn't, then the client doesn't think it can connect to it. We don't have that many of those devices, and it's not proving to be a showstopper. And it's just that's fortunate because that's not something we can easily opt out, because the potential clients of those devices could be anything that's on the wireless. Then it's not a problem with the device, but with the client, but rather a device with a problem with a device that is a wired thing elsewhere on our network that is not on the wireless that we have put option 108 onto. But what I would like to stress is that I've detailed these problems. Hopefully, maybe other people, this will help other people who might be bitten by these. But on a network of 35,000 peak concurrent users and in excess of 30,000 individual users, 70,000 devices over the course of a week, this has thus far generated us 50 support tickets that we've managed to attribute to this. So there may be people suffering in silence. That might not be the full story, but we're not talking thousands. We're not even talking hundreds. We've had 50 tickets over the course of 3 months. The final takeaway, which was touched on in the very good previous talk, it's a wild card, but in terms of kind of what we're looking at next, Windows we watch with bated breath, in as much as we don't have. We are a Windows house in terms of managed devices. Probably at least 80% of our managed estate is Windows. Most of the laptops are Windows. So nearly everything that we have seen option 108 with so far has been bring your own device stuff. These are personally owned devices. A handful of managed Macs. And the problems that we have had so far have all been with managed Macs in terms of VPNs and the wireless screen sharing and that kind of thing. With the exception of the actual phones, it's been the Macs. And when Windows does gain CLAT support, it might shake a lot more nuanced applications out, because we're not seeing managed laptops really participating in this yet. It may be, but if that does become a problem, then our kind of worst case solution would be to put the managed laptops into a separate subnet that doesn't have option 108, because we're still getting the biggest benefit here, and that is that our wireless, for the most part, is full of phones that are in people's pockets that aren't doing anything most of the time. They're walking along campus, and they would be consuming a v4 address if it wasn't for option 108. And as a result of having done this, we've dropped the number of v4 neighbors on our wireless routers by 75%. We've saved ourselves a lot of v4 address space, and whilst we have moved to RFC 1918, there isn't unlimited amounts of it. It's saving on our ARP tracking to know who's had what IP addresses when we don't need to track all those v4 addresses. And for a lot of clients, it's a reduced overhead in that we're not troubleshooting two protocols across the network. So even if we had to auth a few thousand Windows devices on a 40,000 network into a non-option 108, it's a win for getting it out there for all of the bring your own device stuff, which we've had very few problems with. Any questions?
Thanks. Thank you so much. This is super insightful. Possibly with the naivete of being a client implementer, I'm curious about what the problem was with DHCP option 108 load, because the packet volume I'm napkin mathing doesn't seem to be very high. If there was something you wanted to tell a future CLAT implementer about how to use option 108, what would you tell them hypothetically?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that. You're asking, was that about the sheer the number of DHCP discovers that we were seeing? Right.
Earlier you were talking about that being an issue, but if you were doing one every, like if it was a 5-minute return interval on 108, that doesn't seem like a very high volume of traffic. Is that something where I'm underestimating how much load it takes to make DHCP complicated? What am I missing here?
I guess it depends what you call a high volume of traffic. So we're talking about 40,000, well, maybe say 30,000 devices that once every 5 minutes were going through a DHCP discover process. And of course, it's not just one DHCP discover. We're running VRRP, so both routers relay that. So immediately it's twice the volume. Due to RPF dropping some of them, you can end up with some retries. So, I mean, there's a bit of amplification going on, but the default limits in Junos aren't very high. I think we were talking about exceeding 1,000 discovers a second, I think, which it was enough to, it was the aggregate limit on the router that was exceeded, i.e. the amount that the whole box is allowed to consume. The actual, the individual flow policing was kicking in, but the aggregate of all of the individually policed flows that were acceptable still reached an aggregate that was in excess of what the inbuilt protection was. We raised it, and I mean, arguably, it wasn't high enough on what those routers are doing. You know, I mean, in many ways, it's an artifact of us having a centrally tunneled wireless network. In that we've got two routers effectively handling half of the entire Imperial estate. In that all wireless is routed on two routers, but all wired is spread across 20 or 30 routers. So they kind of need to have a DDoS limit that is the same as the aggregate across all our other routers put together.
Well, great. Thank you very much, David. I'm sure you'll have more discussions during the break. Mm-hmm. Thanks again.
No worries.